7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
Thankfully, we're not here today to talk about me, but to visit a young man from Glasgow called Donovan Leach, who lives not in this palatial mansion, which is pictured behind me, but in equally attractive but rather more modest accommodation, which is situated just down the road.
And the rivers there, they all ran red from the blood that spilled on Alma. Let Britain's songs long remember the glorious 20th of September. We caused the Russian to surrender all on the heights of Alma. Let Britain's songs long remember the glorious 20th of September. We caused the Russian to surrender all on the heights.
The house is in the south of England, and you spent a number of your formative years here, but a lot of people at home might like to know how long you were in Glasgow in Scotland, and just tell us a wee bit about your early history.
Well, yeah, I come from Glasgow, dear old Glasgow too.
Mary Hill, eh?
Yeah, Mary Hill, although I don't remember much of that. But when I was 10, my father moved down here. But from the age of 1 to 7, they say, is the very formative years. And I absorbed the complete Scottish upbringing with Irish mother, Scottish father. I was under the table at the parties listening to the songs. I saw, the aunties and the uncles punching the hell out of each other and then making up later and all that.
There was a thing Alex was talking about. Alex Harvey was saying that he felt that the singing auntie and uncle was an important part of the Scottish heritage,
I think so. I mean, me with the shandy under the table with the other cousins, listening to the songs and the encouragement and the coaxing to get one singer up, and that one singer gets up and that one singer does the party piece. And remember, it was a Catholic family, my mother, so there was lots and lots of relatives. So there was lots and lots of songs. So I absorbed all that. Even in the Protestant side, with the kilts and the hairy legs, father's crowd went up the hills. They went up onto the mountains, so I got a lot of the tramping songs. And this was before radio and rock and roll, because that was an influence to me as well. But before I left Glasgow, I think I'd absorbed the total feeling. And then from my dad's side, he was an amateur theatrical during the war, and he played for the servicemen. And he was well into musical comedy. And so I'd get all that when he'd read it to me. And then on the other side, he'd be into Burns and Shelley and a few poets, and he was a well-read man. But he gave me a lot of Robert Burns. And I think in the cradle there, or when I grew up, I got a good dose of culture, although I was, by that time, in Anderson, throwing cans of ashes at other kids across the backyard and all that. So I did the whole Glasgow thing. But when I was 10, you see, I'd moved to the south of England with my rambling dad, who was following the emigrations out of the tough areas into the new towns in the south, the aircraft factory in Hatfield, and spent sort of 2 or 3 years in schools, normal. And then when I left, I wouldn't continue on in school, really. I got to further ed and then had a listen in the common room to a few jazz records, read a few books, Zen Buddhism, listened to a few old blues, and then joined the exodus to St Ives and hitchhiked away. And
that was a big, just to go pick up, that was the big folk centre at that time.
Yeah, St Ives was a painter's paradise, from 100 years ago. But it was the most southern spot you could go. It was the Riviera. And a lot of Midland art students and people who considered themselves interested in artistic things would hitchhike away, and you'd sleep in sleeping bags on the beach. And you'd run into a lot of musicians, and that's where I bought my first guitar. I bought it for nothing, £2.10 or something, and it was an old classical guitar. John Vanstone, I remember, had doctored it and put steel strings on it, and that's when I started picking, although I think I'd absorbed all the music, but I hadn't picked until I was 16 or so. Then, hitchhiking about there, I met other people who were actually working. And I met a rhythm and blues group called the Cops and Robbers, and they were in a club in Southend. They were mates of mine from St Albans, which is the beat scene that I was involved with around London, the art students. college dropouts and various people. And I went along to this Cops and Robbers gig, and their manager was there, Pete Eden and Jeff Stevens, songwriter, manager. And they asked me to come up to Tin Pan Alley in Denmark Street, and I went up and worked for Southern Music, which is interesting because they're all involved in America, in the origins of American folk music, country music, in Nashville, Hickory record label I was on over there. And it was in Denmark Street where I cut my first 2 or 3 songs and ended up in Ready, Steady, Go, being a minstrel. At the same time, I felt I was absorbing a brand new market into folk music, to freshen folk music up, to make it more alive, and to mix the two. I felt even then...
Well, that's not very popular.
No, it wasn't.
With the purists.
No, it never made me very popular. And the first slagging I got was in all the folk clubs had the little cartoons cut out. And whenever I appeared... So I never worked for a living in my life in a folk club. This is the most amazing thing. I never really worked my way up. It was from the street to that one club in South End, to Denmark Street, to 3 television shows. It was big leaps. And the folk purists didn't like that because I was selling it. The folk purists don't want you to sell. You don't want you to be commercial. There's still roll necks and short hair job in the folk clubs, and all this singing with the hand in the ear. And of course, the great exponent of it married the Seeger girl. It's terrible. It's Ewan. It's big slagging even to forget his name. But when I arrived, Ewan said, you know, no good. And I felt that I was part of the tradition. I felt I was coming back. I was too young, and I got upset with him. And I was the kid on the scene then, because I was like 2 or 3 years younger. But I'd already put in a couple of years hitchhiking about, so I'd heard and met a few people. But it was in London when I was 16 or 17 that I ran into David Graham, Bert Jansch, John Martin briefly.
Did David Graham and did they belong to a beatnik thing? Were they? Yeah. They must have been quite a bit older than you were. They would. Yeah.
Well, what if the Stones and the Yardbirds and the Kinks and the Beatles in their own way in the Midlands were into the rhythm and blues club? I was into the folk club, but there was blues there too. But it was acoustic blues, and that would be David Graham and Bert Jansch. And when I ran into them, that was your folk scene. Now, I've realised in recent years that a lot of movements come out of art school in Britain, especially art school, because in the late 50s or the mid-50s there was a great encouragement by the government for the art schools. And what they thought maybe they were breeding painters, but actually they're breeding musicians. And I remember going to not art school, because I never went to the actual art school. We had the art class, and I knew a lot of art students in art school in St Albans. And in the common room, there was the records, the rare rhythm and blues record, the rare folk song, the rare this, the rare that. But it was very American, it's true. Our eye was towards America. But as we've seen in British popular music, the root is here. But some of the influences are rhythm and blues.
When you say the roots here, do you mean the root from centuries before, or the more recent root?
Well, when the Beatles played rhythm and blues, or I played what I considered a modern song, you could hear underneath it. There was a tradition to it. You get it a little bit with the Byrds in the States and with Neil Young and Dylan when they write. There's a root to their music. You can see it's very deep. And so what I mean is, although American music influenced Britain, the longest lasting, most successful music in the world seems to have been British. And I attribute it to a history of music, pre-Christian, almost like your old pagan Britain coming out through the music. A love of in fact, the balladeers and the music of the old sort of mysterious religion before Christianity was very famous in Europe. It seems to continue to be famous. Although you can hear rhythm and blues and rock and roll, their actual writing and the depth of feeling in the British writing seems to be very, very popular. And that's the next part of any conversation about British music being such an influence in the English-speaking world, is that there were these travellings from Ireland and Scotland, and that gospel and black music creates rhythm and blues. And in the South, especially in South of America, the United States, I mean, where you got a lot of immigration and you got a lot of mixture of Appalachian sort of people who were really owed their roots to Europe. I'm sure there's a lot of, there's French in the South and the Florida region and New Orleans creating the Cajun music. And you've got French in the high North, in the mountains up in Canada. Yeah, I subscribe to that. I say that, yeah, the reason why country music goes down so well in Ireland and Scotland is because it's its natural home, almost.
A lot of your songs are, you know, your bases, although you're aware of rock and roll, is really folk music. I mean, do you think that influence came from the Scottish thing, or did you pick that up later on when you...
Well, I thought I'd picked it up when I started listening to Joan Baez and Dylan when I was in the South here in school. But in recent years, or later years, I realised that I am the minstrel of these islands. If they said I was the British Bob Dylan, it wasn't clear enough. The real description is that I represent that old Scottish, Irish, well, mostly Scottish, situation of the one man with the one guitar and penning his own songs. And in my softer ballads about the land and about nature, on the albums that I've done, which I considered what they used to call children's records, actually they're ballads about the land, and the land is Scotland, and that's my upbringing. Although I was born in the city in a tenement, when I went into the greenery in the north of Scotland, I felt at home.
Did you feel anything about the fact that you seem to have always been somebody who's worked by themselves? You write all your own songs by yourself. You never seem to have had a permanent group band. It seemed something that we had touched on thinking about Scotland, that it seems to be a singular move that people have.
Yes, yes, you were talking about that, and it seems to be true. Of course, I had never been involved in groups that much, I didn't notice, but now you mention it, I see it. Chip on the shoulder, having to come down south to get your stuff heard and things like that.
The long trek.
Yeah.
And very often, even in bands, they'll start off with 4 or 5, and then eventually only one person surviving.
Well, maybe it's what my father said, a man is never recognised so much in his own land as in another land, where they can see you as you project yourself. Whereas in Glasgow, when you get up, I go up and do a gig in Glasgow, I haven't done one for years, but my accent smoothed out a bit, although I can talk just like anybody else up there, you know, when I get talking with people that come from there. And when I get up on the stage there and I'm introducing a song and I'm saying, the next song is, I got a slight Atlantic English Scottish accent, and from the back of the hall, oh, you're off oity-toity now. So he knows my background, he probably knows my aunt. So in your own land, they know your background. When you're projecting your image and your dream and what you feel, they see the dream and the image and what your projection, but they know your background.
That also makes you vulnerable when you project as well, do you not think that?
Yeah, you mean anywhere?
Yeah, well, I think especially at home, because you're going for that thing which you...
Yes.
You know,
whereas in England, they'll just see, or in America, they'll see your projection, they'll see what you're actually presenting, not your background. And maybe that's what that trek is about, you know, that you have to leave to present your work.
But you trekked back again.
Yeah, I went back. In '69, I said to my father, find me an island in the west coast of Scotland. I've had enough of this. I'm going to buy this lovely island if you can find me one. So one day I got a call from him, and he's in a call box somewhere in the Western Isles, somewhere in the West. He said, the wind is very, very wild up here. It's almost blowing the box down. I said, where are you? He said, oh, I'm off in the somewhere, you know. I said, well, what have you found? He said, I found an island up in the north of Skye here. So we go up there, and there's an old laird in a dilapidated estate, still working the cows he is on an old Land Rover, with a history, you know, going back, and still got crofters, and I caught the end of the Western Isles just before everybody ran in and bought everything, and it was marvellous. I bought the island of Isay that had been offered to Dr. Johnston on his trip up there. It was beautiful, it was called Isay. It had a bird sanctuary on a little island next to it, it had seals, and I bought in. And I was going to have a commune and retire from the world with all my mates from art school. And of course a commune, everybody knows about a commune now, everybody has to work together. And of course none of us worked together, everybody just got high and drunk and sang songs down the pub. And there was a bit of work done, you know, but not much. We renovated a couple of old cottages. I went out on the boat a few times to the island and lay there, just lying back in the sun. Seagulls owned the island, I didn't own the island. Seagulls attacked me when I went on the island. It was lovely, it was beautiful, and it is the Western Isles, and it's fantastic, and Scotland is the last wilderness of Europe. It's beautiful.
There's a movement in Scotland now, I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, where a lot of younger musicians have started their own kind of cottage record industry.
Yeah, I think I've heard about it, yeah.
And I wondered maybe if you, because I feel that's something that perhaps you would
Yeah.
relate to, the kind of person that you are.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's good. Especially in the climate of the record industry now, where there's no big money, no backing, and no belief in a band that doesn't do something for themselves first. And the bands are having to work harder and practice more. And that sounds great, just to be able to create your own label and just move so many thousands to your people that you know, without dealing with the mass media.
Yeah. Do you think that if that had happened earlier on in the record business, not just in Scotland but in other areas, that it would have meant musicians would have stayed where they were rather than...
You know, Linda, my wife, and I, we talk socially about what's happened to us in the last 20 years. And we know a lot of bands and we know a lot of experiences about this business. And, do you know, it couldn't have happened then because we, the various British artists that went through the big mill in the 60s and got ground up in the business, we created the precedents for most of the... I went through my hassles, the Beatles went through theirs. Everybody, we all went through these hassles and they were made public. And because they were made public, new bands would watch out for these problems, whereas when we began, it really was Cliff Richard, Adam Faith. It was the old days, you know. I can make you a star, boy. So, I mean, unless that had happened in the... What happened to us had happened in the 50s, we couldn't have done this independent record thing, but it did happen in the 50s. There was a lot of independents who probably had learned from the 40s. But I think the 70s learned from the 60s a lot and realised that you can actually get your own record together, because in the 60s, nobody thought about making their own records at all.
Do you think physically that will mean that bands will, if you've got your own record label in Glasgow and you live in Glasgow, do you think that bands can continue to work from that?
I see what you mean, don't have to leave.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, you know, with Scotland and with Northern Ireland are definitely linked with the South, you know, and any enterprising young manager would want to move a band on, present him in South Europe and even take on America. So I think these success stories maybe have their own legs and they can take the boy away or the young band away, the young girl away. But I think it's good see, I never grew up 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old years in Glasgow, so I was a wanderer anyway. But people that grow up through their teens in Scotland, I'm sure that they do feel they'd like to stay there, you know, without travelling. But a record might take them away, success might take them away. But that's another thing that new groups have learned, new bands, that the burnout period is shorter and shorter as we move on. Whereas there was a 5-year success span once, it's now down to 2, maybe 18 months. Right. So maybe they're learning that, and they say when they leave Glasgow, I hope they do feel this, when they leave Scotland, that there's going to be a turnaround, and maybe they should keep a foot in the land that they love, or the place they like.
Do you think that younger musicians today want that, or do you think that they have do you think they've learned anything, like you're saying? Do you think that they...
I think the majority of them haven't learned anything. I mean...
They still want to be pop stars.
Yeah, it is see it on the TV or hear it on the radio and say, that's good, I can do that. The good thing is they can say, I can do that. I mean, that's what we all had to say. I can do that. I want to do that. And a lot of them must say that to get out. And it must look like you can get out. I think it's harder in sports. It's probably even harder in music. But you don't have to work for so many years in music. You know, you can learn a few chords and get off straight away. But the few that have learned tend to be the singer-songwriters that have actually got possible cult status because theirs is not just one song shared amongst 5 in writing. They want to actually write their songs. And I'm a singer-songwriter, so I know more about that, I suppose. The few that are singer-songwriters, yeah, they've learned a lot and they look. But everybody's trying to break in. And when people say to me, how do you break into this business? Well, I fell in. But you can actually plan it now. Whereas we couldn't then, in the mid-60s. You can actually go and you can meet producers, more publishers now, and there's more little studios. Whenever anybody writes to me, I say, get to know your local scene, get to know the local studio, get to know the local guy who wants to produce, and start on the grassroots, you know, rather than phone up people in London and big cities. There are little things happening locally, everywhere now, that's the difference. It was only London. There was only studios in London in 1966. It's quite amazing.